What will the Philadelphia Eagles rushing attack look like for fantasy football in 2022? Find out today. Jim Coventry with RotoWire breaking down today's NFL news and notes during training camp. Look, in the Philadelphia backfield, Miles Sanders is the most expensive piece of the backfield, but fantasy managers are not jumping all over him, getting picked in the 7th round or so of recent drafts. And the thing with Sanders is fantasy managers like him because they look at the yards per carry. 4.6 as a rookie, 5.3 in his second year, and 5.5 last year. But there's a lot underneath the surface that makes us wonder what's going on here. First of all, and we do know he, after 16 games in his rookie season, he missed 4 in his second year. He missed 5 last year. So that'll explain these yardage drops. He went from 1,300 to 1,050 to 900. So basically in 12 games, he's been about a 950 yard back the last 2 seasons. So again, that 1,300 yard season, that really helps that he had more games. And he did have 6 touchdowns in each of his first 2 seasons, and he had 0 last year. So that's a bit of an anomaly. But Jordan Howard was used heavily at the goal line last year. So again, Sanders may have had more opportunities, but the team went in a different direction there. So here's where we can make a little bit of a case. In his last 2 12-game seasons, so 2020 and 2021, he had 216 touches in 2020. He was down to 171 last year. Here's what I believe the rub on Miles Sanders is. So first of all, we like the numbers, like I said, but the NFL teams, they want consistency from down to down. Miles Sanders, in my opinion, does not bring that. He still bounces too many runs to the outside, doesn't always run the play as designed, and that inconsistency breaks down drives, which is what the NFL teams are most concerned about. So Miles Sanders has seen a diminishing workload. We saw him ceding carries to a bunch of backs. That's your Jordan Howard, Boston Scott, Kenny Gainwell, which leads me to Kenny Gainwell. Now, Jordan Howard's not back this year, which is good because more goal line, not for Jordan Howard, love the guy, but for goal line opportunities for the other Philadelphia backs. I want to talk about Kenny Gainwell for a minute. He's 5'9", 200, so a little bit on the light side, but what we saw last year, first of all, he had 68 carries and he had 50 targets, but his weekly usage was all over the board, and it really did dry up from like maybe week 6 or so on. It dried up quite a bit. He did have a couple usage weeks after that. But what I want to point out is he had a respectable 4.3 yards per carry. We'd like that to be a little bit better, especially with Jalen Hurts as a mobile quarterback behind that great line. But we like his 7.7 yards per reception. He was really good as a receiver. Now, his broken tackle rate was excellent too, 93rd percentile, but he only got 58th percentile yards after contact. So he was breaking tackles, not making a lot happen after that. Maybe a year of development. We're hopeful that, as you get in your NFL body a bit, and that happens a lot with these running backs. You get that NFL body after training with the NFL for a little while. We're expecting maybe Gainwell to be a little bit sturdier for that this year. But here's the main thing I want to point out. In the 6 games that Gainwell had 23 or more snaps, listen to these PPR point totals: 12.3, 20.9, 16.1, 19.7, 18.7, and 16.5. He was an outstanding producer, but it was only 6 games he had that many snaps. Now, I do believe with Miles Sanders, in my opinion, a player the coaches are not going to endear themselves to. And the big thing was that he was seeing second team snaps in practice, but that was explained away. It was just one of those things. Backs rotate. I still think, though, there is a place where Gainwell can usurp that job. Now, you're going to make a little bit of a speculation on draft day to do that, but the draft capital for Gainwell is 12th or 13th round in most leagues. So that's a very cheap price. And again, if he even gets a part-time role in this, if he gets a 50-50 role, he could easily blow that ADP away. And if somehow he works into a majority of the workload, he could be a great, great RB2 for fantasy managers. So don't sleep on one Kenny Gainwell. Miles Sanders, again, draft at your own peril, but I don't like the trends. Again, yards per carry are fine. Let's move to Russell Gage. Didn't talk about him the other day. We talked about the Buccaneers passing game. Didn't spend enough time on him. Todd Bowles, the head coach of the Bucs, is saying that Russell Gage can't be covered by the Buccaneers defensive backs. You know what? Russell Gage really improved in his seasons in the league. Last year, he had similar numbers to 2020 in the 700-yard range, but he looked to be a much better receiver last year. I didn't think much of him in 2020 and in his rookie year 2019. I didn't see him, reliably getting open. But last year that changed. The switch really went on, and he was a very reliable target for Matt Ryan. And so now we move to Tampa. And again, the big problem is Julio Jones is in town. And I've talked before, I think Julio is going to see a limited snap share. Chris Godwin, we hear great reports, not quite sure if he'll be back early in the season, a little bit later, if he'll be ramped up. But that said, Russell Gage is going to get snaps. Now, the ADP has to go down because he was being drafted before Julio was there, is 7th and 8th round in some leagues. And that was a reasonable draft price, because if the Bucs are going to throw in the vicinity of 650, 700 times, they threw almost 720 times last year. So Russell Gage was a great fantasy play, because certainly Brady, if he realizes he's got a good receiver open, he's going to throw it his way. He's got Mike Evans, he's got Chris Godwin, and now Julio. But now again, with the extra receiver in town and a superstar, 3 superstars, Gage is going to have to fall to the 10th or 11th round before I get somewhat re-interested in him. The shares I already have, those are already shares that are spent. He would need an injury, which in that room is very possible. We've seen Evans, Godwin, and Jones miss significant time over the last few seasons. So if you did have shares of Gage in best ball, it's still reasonable they could pay off. But again, if you're drafting now, I definitely think you can't take that early ADP, and it's going to be adjusting quickly. We'll probably have some updated ADP numbers really soon. But again, don't really look at him until at least the 10th round, because this snap share just isn't going to be there. Now, Travis Etienne is apparently the star of Jaguars camp. This is all camp stuff. We don't, maybe not. But nonetheless, it's still good at this positive buzz. Etienne is a first-round draft pick. They picked him 25th in the 2020 draft, and obviously he missed last year with the Liz Frank injury. Now, the one thing we worry about, we're not going to hear during camp, is when he gets into games, one of the complaints about players who come back is there's a screw in his foot, and sometimes the wear and tear of that screw becomes problematic. Now, Etienne had mentioned at one point he wants to screw out, but to my knowledge, that hasn't been the case yet. So there is some risk that the screw could become problematic and maybe limit his snaps. James Robinson looks to be cleared for camp, coming off the Achilles. They don't need him to be the superstar. They just need him to be reliable and to get some snaps. So Etienne could lose snaps. I think people that are assuming Etienne is a 3-down back, I don't know if that's going to stack up anyway, because I don't know if the Jaguars see him as, a high volume running back. I think they love him as a receiver, mix him in as a runner. I think they'd like to see that. But you see, I think he's going to be more of a runner here. James Robinson is very reliable in pass pro. Etienne's a small dude. And unless he really shows extremely well in pass pro, it's very possible that James Robinson is not there because of his receiving chops. He's a good receiver, but he may be there just to keep Trevor Lawrence upright and get the ball to the other receivers they have. So Etienne, though his star is on the rise, his ADP is going up, aggressively picked as high as the 3rd round in some leagues, and I definitely can see the merit for that. But if he loses 3rd down work to James Robinson, that's a ding, because we know targets are more valuable than carries. But nonetheless, Travis Etienne's star is on the rise, and I would like to see this young man perform very well and have a great career. And I don't think anybody is you're justified by taking him early if you believe that he is going to come out and be a superstar. And you know what? He could take a 3-down role. If he not be as a superstar, the coaches may not be able to keep him off the field. Allen Lazard, let's talk about him for a minute. So Aaron Rodgers basically came out and said, yeah, he has the number 1 role. But he also said, Aaron Rodgers, that he was surprised that teams passed as much as they did on Romeo Doubs, who they got a little bit later in the draft, I believe the 4th round. So now let's think about this for a minute. So Allen Lazard is the number 1 receiver there. And the thing I have concerns about, he's an excellent blocker. And he's functioned so well for them in that capacity. And we don't know how much he's going to do that now. But assuming he's been a good receiver and they've used him. But if teams go into games seeing him as the number 1 option and they treat him as such, now where does that put his ceiling and floor at? I think he could struggle if he sees, a top end corner. He could struggle if on certain plays he's bracketed. And I don't know that teams will do that, but he could be. So it's important to understand that he could be very matchup dependent. And don't forget, Rodgers has averaged 533 pass attempts in the last 2 years. That's not a high volume passing attack. They could run a lot. Now, Romeo Doubs. Look, his ADP in some high stakes has gone up to 16th round. So people are realizing there's buzz on him. There was buzz on him earlier. I actually, was kind of nervous 4th round, but I did have a couple shares of him, and I do think he's a player to take a dart throw on, because if you get Aaron Rodgers' trust, and he had a good practice the other day, a couple of touchdowns, he got hit really hard over the middle on a downfield catch, and he made that and held on to him. So he could be getting Aaron Rodgers' trust. That leaves us with Christian Watson. Well, he's missing time, and he comes from a small school, and you know what? Unless we get some real positive buzz on Christian Watson, it's very possible that Rodgers is already building chemistry and trust. And the longer this goes and we don't hear positive buzz on Watson, it's problematic. Again, Romeo Doubs at a really cheap draft cost. He's somebody you could drop after week 2 if he's not doing anything. I think you like to take those dice rolls late in drafts for that particular reason. You want to be able to be pliable on the waiver wire. But if you have a player who you feel compelled to hold on to, even if he's not doing anything, those often clog up a roster and make things very difficult. Now, Hayden Hurst over in Cincinnati. Look, Hayden Hurst, we don't know what he is as a receiver yet. He was blocked by Austin Hooper, who was performing well when in Atlanta. And then, of course, Kyle Pitts came in last year, and he was the guy. Hayden Hurst has never really had a chance to be the guy. And coming into Cincinnati, C.J. Uzomah was at 493 yards and 5 touchdowns last year. Now, he had 2 big games. He had 2 90-plus yard games. I know he scored in those games. So he was very, very volatile. But that said, look, defenses are going to have their hands full, obviously, with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. We saw it in Dallas last year when defenses were worried about CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper. Well, guess who was running open in the middle of the field? Dalton Schultz. Hayden Hurst is now in a similar situation here. And now Tyler Boyd definitely is in the slot. So I think there's a little more talent there in Cincinnati than there was in Dallas. But the fact that Uzomah put up those numbers, I think it is not irresponsible at all to say Hurst can surpass those numbers. So it makes him the borderline tight end one, which is really a low bar to set after 7 or 8 tight ends. It does fall off significantly, but there's no reason to pass on Hayden Hurst because of the opportunity. And if you're in a best ball league, those spike weeks definitely could be there. And one more player for today. Let's talk about Chase Claypool for a moment. So right now he's dealing with a minor shoulder injury, and we don't know what that means. He could be out a day. He could already be back at practice as I speak right now. So we're not quite sure what that entails. But we do know in his rookie season, he had 873 yards and 9 touchdowns. And last year, other than the touchdowns, his yardage was pretty close. His targets were right there. So he had 2 similar seasons with the touchdowns being the outlier. We have to understand, though, that Claypool was playing with Ben Roethlisberger, who I talked about during that time, before that time, his arm was toast. And Claypool at his best, he has 90th percentile explosiveness. He runs a 4.4 at 6'4", 238. This is a vertical downfield weapon. I don't know if he's an X or a Z receiver. I really don't know what he'll shape up to. He could be a stretch Z. I don't know that his route running is at the point where we could say he lines up on the line of scrimmage on the isolated side, which is the X, and then battling that tough coverage. And maybe a Z, he's off the line of scrimmage a bit, gets a little more of a free release. But regardless of what he is, look, Mitch Trubisky, we don't know what he is. We know we don't like what we saw. I really think that the coaching did him a disservice. I know that when Trubisky at times was rolled out to the right and they gave him predefined short, intermediate, and deep reads, when he only had to read half the field, he was serviceable. He was good. He won people the Millie Maker on 2 occasions in DFS. So Chase Claypool to win contested catches downfield, I think that there's a great scenario where Mitch Trubisky could make good use of him. Now, will Trubisky stay in a quarterback long? We don't know that. And how would Kenny Pickett match up with him? Regardless, Chase Claypool is going roughly in the 10th round of a lot of drafts. He is a player that if you feel compelled to go after, he could have a good season. Again, Trubisky, in my mind, has a much liver arm than obviously Ben Roethlisberger did. And George Pickens could be an issue here. George Pickens could emerge. George Pickens could cut into Claypool's share. But Claypool's a third-year vet. He showed well. And my guess is right now, it would be his job to lose. And if he comes back from this shoulder injury somewhat quickly, then my guess is he'd have a chance to do that. You're taking a risk. There is downside with Claypool. We have, even with Ben, it was definitely explained away. He hasn't really broken out yet. So there's that. But I do think he's very talented, and he's a player that you would want a couple shares if you're investing in a lot of leagues. All right, good for today. Hope everybody enjoys the day, and we'll be back soon with more NFL training camp news and notes.